And welcome, people, to the next lecture. Hope you had a good break. And I hope you will like this one. Most people are into beats and the cutting, slicing, manipulation of beat-based material is definitely part of the aesthetic in recent decades. So we'll go through some history here, some techniques. I'm going to show you a patch, and I'm going to let you spend some time with some available, interesting implementations. Have some fun. Great. So, well, it all started with the ability to record sound and people playing back the music rather than making it. And evidently there were experiments with using recorded sound, different media, to produce new music early on as well. The whole French tradition of musique concrète was kind of based around recorded sound, manipulating it, which was initially on records. They had slightly larger discs, bigger grooves, more machinery involved. And then at some point tape kicked in, which was more compact. And in fact, it allowed for splicing, for cutting it up and pasting it together, editing the tape, which was a whole new world. Suddenly the time was made discontinuous in music for the first time, probably. And evidently, every discontinuity, each time something breaks or becomes breakable, typically artists engage and they can make use of it. The progressive artists. But the actual beat manipulation as we know it today, the genres that are based around it, came somewhat later. This gear was not very accessible initially. And the tape-based editing, splicing of the tape did not excite let's say, dance music producers as much as samplers did. So actually this whole craze around looped beats came with the samplers. You can actually produce a tape loop. You can run a piece of tape that is pasted to its own beginning, the end to the beginning. And you can stretch it around the studio using many objects. They're even specialized kind of little columns that allow you to stretch the tape sufficiently. When the tape runs in the deck, it doesn't need to be fully stretched. Kind of needs to lay loose around objects. Because the actual pulling mechanism are the rubber wheels, capstans, I believe they're called. It's been a while. So after that came the sampler engines, and that changed the game because first of all, the duration of material that could be stored in a sampler was really short. So the manipulation of the existing material was being pushed. And also because the resequencing of that material was made remote, was distanced from the actual acquisition of the material. So you suddenly had a division into two totally different devices and paradigms, in fact. So suddenly sampled material could actually contain multiple instruments as well. The idea of playing back instruments, different sounds, was available previously, but to actually reproduce the actual recording, which is a kind of a quote into the or from the past, is quite new as the samplers kick in. So yeah, I mean, these samplers were typically slightly foul sounding, but that, I mean, in relation to the kind of reproduction quality we have these days. But that foulness, that special character, is something that people will actually still desire in their productions at times. Okay, so that was this initiation of producers to resampling, to manipulating existing music in a whole different way. And it was before the computers were able to handle audio. Okay, so I mean, actually in the late 80s, you had first few Macs with audio input output devices, but they couldn't really process a lot of audio signals or do much to them. And then in the early 90s, PCs caught up and you could buy sound cards that would actually play back sounds at that sample rate. Before that, the digital audio did exist, but it was actually typically limited to a few digital oscillators and some filters, wavetables. So what you will find, for example, in arcade games in the 70s, early 80s, it was a digital music chip, a digital sound chip, but it couldn't replay what is recorded. You could come up with ways of controlling these basic oscillators, filters, and waveforms, and that could make a sound which sounds a bit like an explosion, sounds a bit like a gunshot, all the things that arcades needed. And you can indeed recognize, you can hear it in those early digital sounds, that it's not recorded. It's a kind of a emulation of a certain sound source, and you could do quite a lot with a few digital oscillators in an FM structure. You can actually come close to a whole lot of different sounds. You can create vocal type sounds and all sorts, which was evidently quite interesting back then, especially because you didn't have anything more in terms of sound synthesis like that. Few photos of early sampling hardware, MPC 60. So typically this hardware would allow you to sequence as well as record samples. Basic editing. Typically, one of the early things you could manipulate was playback rate. That's one of the simple digital processes. And indeed, a lot of the aesthetic, kind of early jungle music, it all relies on actually speeding up drum samples, or indeed having beats played double time and half time simultaneously. So essentially, these early samplers were the tools that afforded this type of manipulation. And a decent artist can actually stretch the boundaries of any tools, as long as it's scarce and desired. S900, probably the most legendary, really cumbersome to use. I think I had to go some 20 years ago. Back then it was already out of the how should I say, out of the loop. So yeah, 3/4 of a megabyte. I don't know if anyone can understand what a megabyte is these days. 750 kilobytes. So yeah, megabyte. That used to be half the floppy disk, half the big floppy disk. I believe the large floppy disk, 5.2 inches, were about 360. I think 360K was the first floppy I held in my hand. Before that, it was just tape, really. And tape could store digital data, right? So I don't know, you probably know, maybe not. Early game consoles like Commodore would have different games stored on different tapes, but the speed of reading was silly slow at that stage. So yeah, this 750K of RAM probably costed as much as 4 terabytes now, or more. So you typically had up to 32 sample slots, 12-bit depth for the samples. Weird sampling rates, 40K. It was before the 44K standard. Typically slightly lower, I think. DX7 ran on some weird 37K or something like this. So before we had the standard there, it was all over the place. So about 11 seconds. You paid a few grand for 11 seconds back in the day, and that was huge. Okay, and then slowly, as computers became fast enough to manipulate audio, one of the first software was Recycle. Although even before their time, trackers allowed you to essentially insert samples and play them back at different speeds. Trackers came essentially before the Windows-based operating systems. I mean, Mac had a kind of Windows and desktop type operating system in the 80s already. But for the PC, it was actually only, well, maybe very late 80s, but essentially for the user, it was the early 90s, where you started to have a graphical interface. Before that, it was just the prompt, so you actually had to type every command, hit enter. ASCII graphics were very rudimentary. But even in that environment, we had trackers that allowed us to sequence sampled material. Okay, so that's the bit of the history. And then, well, beat cutting. I mean, I'm not sure if there is much to say which is not evident. You probably recognize it as you hear it as well. And essentially, we have two genres pretty much built on these sampling engines, jungle and hip hop. With drum and bass already, it comes slightly later, and at that stage you have more tools. But typically jungle tracks, hip hop beats, they could fit in one of these S900s, and maybe a mixer or a few effects on top. But that was the day of 2 or 3 bits of hardware in the rack, and that's all you've got, and that's a chart-breaking tool as it appeared to become. Now, breakbeat music is a term that comes maybe in the late 90s, second half of the 90s, and it's essentially the commercialization of these techniques, and gets closer to funk, gets closer to kind of music that a wider audience may appreciate. But the whole looping in itself, the aesthetic around exact timing was already in full swing, because already in the 80s, maybe already late 70s, you can notice that drummers start to mimic drum machines. So when the drum machine comes in and produces this extremely precise, non-human, mechanistic beat, there is a huge interest from audience, from producers in this new aesthetic. So at that stage, the drummers start doing this. But by the time the samplers kick in, we actually have that aesthetic already, well, past the peak, potentially, I might say. It really depends on which cultural environment you consider. But the progressives were definitely beyond exact timing. So what you have is that pretty much as soon as the samplers become available, the progressives, the more underground artists, would already get funny timing, right? So depending on how you cut the loop, you will see some techniques. You can actually chop up the loop and play back the underlying pieces at different speeds. So typically what comes in as a breakbeat is slightly later than the pioneers on the samplers, and they were actually still stuck with the aesthetic of, okay, it's a very, reliable beat, very obvious, well-cut loop, so to speak. Okay, so we can talk briefly about the kind of manipulations. I mean, evidently in the early days, it was all open for interpretation, and slowly but surely, the actual operations behind certain audio, certain beats, certain music becomes more and more concealed. Probably indeed, when once the samplers got into larger studios, it became increasingly easy to produce a totally unexpected sound and produce a sound that you could not hear the origin of. It became really easy to confuse the people in terms of the origin, just because of the amount of processes, the fact that you could go back and forth between samplers and different synths or effects. It all kind of explodes with the samplers. But then again, evidently, the masses are not necessarily interested in progressive stuff, so I would think there is still quite a lot of weirdness to dig up from the 90s, if it still prevails. Hard disks, 30 years, 40 years. We didn't quite have internet in this current form in the 90s. Okay, so essentially, in terms of beat cutting, there's quite a lot of interesting things we can get done. It is open for a whole lot of creative inputs, and we have some really advanced stuff as well. Nick Collins typically did implementations for more complex generative beat manipulation, a whole lot of weird things, essentially a little bit of almost kind of a programming language for beat cutting, the BBcut library, initially in Super Collider and then other platforms as well. But typically the first main thing is to have patterns sliced up, and you could have different size slices. Could be bars, could be quarter notes, 16th notes. But typically the idea is that you can have a reliable cut, and that you have all the bits available so you can play them back in sequence, and if the implementation is good, you actually get the same beat. back again. And then you can manipulate on top. Okay, so it kind of goes beyond looping, where you essentially just find the best bit, keep it in the loop. But here with beat cutting, what we actually normally get is kind of internal manipulation of these loops. And then you can change the order of the slices, replay them at different speeds. You can reverse them. That's an interesting effect. Many things. Typically anything you imagine. So if you have a reliable beat to cut up, then you would typically not need to manually attend to it. You can automatically do this. This is what we're gonna be looking at. But technically you could actually adjust your slices as well with the samplers, and evidently with digital material as well. Most implementations don't really worry about the overlaps. If the cuts are sufficiently well done, if there are no gaps, it kind of tends to flow seamlessly. But indeed, you can do quite a bit with the overlaps as well. You can actually have multiple engines, playback engines working in tandem to produce interesting effects. And then the question is, what is the relationship to the original material? So evidently you could overwrite the original feel, the beat, the groove, but you could also try to preserve that, which is something that actually came on the scene before samplers, with DJs essentially having the same two copies of the same record and learning how to keep a little part in the loop by manipulating the actual records. So the aesthetic around repeating things, around settling into something which is machine-like, is becoming stronger at that stage. So actually most of the beat slicing around is based on buffering the audio, so making sure that you have the audio prepared and then playing it back using different tools. Loop-based music has also been widely done with without necessarily preparing the material. You can have live looping situations. But also an interesting consideration may be that you can transform beats in real time without preparation. In fact, I'm not sure how we're going to be with time, but the kind of beat manipulation that I've done is typically resting on a delay line. So what you have is, instead of necessarily buffering, I mean, a delay line is a buffer, by the way. But what you can imagine is that you could keep recording the audio, or actually not recording, you're playing it through the delay line. And every time the delay time jumps up, suddenly you will actually be repeating a part of the beat coming in. And then as it plays on, you will be that much later, so you actually end up with a delay. But if you do these jumps in sync with the beat, then you're kind of doing real-time beat manipulation without recording. So you can actually get away with them, or invent some delay line-based techniques as well. And then arbitrarily complex stuff can happen. You probably all know of Aphex Twin and similar artists who have pushed the limits here in the mid-90s already, late 90s for sure. And then you know, the doors are open, the gates are open. It really depends on your artistic preference. And indeed, this kind of shortening the duration of the slices, being able to play them back at increasing speeds, is probably the kind of sound that you already appreciate and are aware of. Okay, so I will now invite you to go to this link and explore this implementation. Okay, so this is part of the class for self-study. And then in the next video, we will look at a PD implementation. So I'll catch you just after that.